Dodge this.
One world currency.
The New World Order.
Those are the roots of trouble.
I imagine that right now you're feeling a bit like Alice, tumbling down the rabbit hole. Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life. That there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. All I'm offering is the truth, nothing more.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. But I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people.
And now, welcome to another episode of Down the Rabbit Hole. Here's your host from federaljack.com. It's Popeye.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another live edition of DTRH. It is March 26, 2015. On tonight's live edition, I have a very special guest, a very old friend of mine from my early radio days who I am just super excited to have back on the air. It has been way too long since I got a chance to talk to her. And let me tell you, ladies and gentlemen, as always, she rocks the information. Okay, so prepare yourself. It's going to be 2 full hours. What are we talking about tonight? Fukushima. What's Fukushima? Fuka what? Fuka who? Fuka where? That's right. The one thing that's never talked about, apparently. Apparently, it's the elephant in the living room that's leaking radiation into the entire planet, screwing up the Pacific Ocean at the very least, the atmosphere, the food supply, the animals, us. But hey, let's not talk about that. Let's worry about what nonsensical BS is on television. Let's worry about some retarded thing. Let's worry about Ebola. Ooh, be afraid of measles. You really, all the parents that are worried about health, right? And you pro-vaccine parents. Well, I'm worried about my child's welfare. You should really be worried about all the radioactive fallout that's coming over from Fukushima. But we're going to get into that. 2 full hours of this tonight. This is, you know how I am. I don't approach things with fear and scariness. Oh my God, I have iodine that'll get rid of the radiation. No, I don't sell anything. But this does need to be discussed and talked about. It's an ongoing threat to our ecological system, our food supply, the human race. So it needs to be discussed. And I can't think of anybody else in the alternative media to discuss it with other than my special guest. I'm so excited, ladies and gentlemen. Let me bring you back to the airwaves, my good friend, Christina Consolo, a.k.a. RadChick. Welcome back, Christina.
Hey, Popeye. You always nail it with the best intros.
Well, it is the truth. Everything I said is the truth. And honestly, it has been way too long, dear, since you've been on the broadcast.
I agree.
And it's been way too long since my listeners got to benefit from your knowledge level. So let's start off, I guess, back a couple years ago. Let's start off with what is Fukushima? Because a lot of people don't even, I know this might sound surprising to some of the listeners, but there's a lot of people that don't know what Fukushima even is. Okay? So let's rewind a little bit. Fukushima is a nuke power plant over in Japan. After that massive earthquake and tsunami a few years ago, I think it's been 4 years now, right, Christina? 4 now?
Yep.
Okay,
We
so
just had the 4-year anniversary.
so 2011, 4 years ago, this earthquake, massive tsunami hits. Boom, the plant gets hit. Now they have a radiation leak. Then there was a massive, it was a hydrogen explosion, I believe, in one of the buildings. And I'm gonna shut up and let Christina get into this in detail in a minute. But this plant is now leaking radioactive material for 4 years. It's like and radioactive open wound, just into the atmosphere, into the water, and everything, but literally poisoning the planet. And they're not worried about it. They're trying to start World War III, and they're worried about helping the quote-unquote Syrian rebels, a.k.a. ISIS, and funding them, but they're not worried about the radiation that's spewing from this plant that was built by man. This isn't natural. This isn't like something, oh my God, the earth is doing this. We can't control it. No, we did this. And we're not doing anything to mitigate it. It's very, I don't want to say scary because I don't like to, put the fear vibe out, but it is eye-opening to say the least. Anyway, Christina, I'm going to give you the floor. So you can start wherever you want with Fukushima. Explain why this is such a big deal to the people that maybe don't understand. Oh, it's only Japan, right? It doesn't affect us. It's a tiny little nuke plant.
Well, the reason it's such a concern and has always been a concern for me is because I knew a lot about nuclear energy before this accident even happened. And when it did happen and I saw it drop out of the news as quickly as it did, I knew something was up. And then they started seeing these blue rainbows. They're called neutron beams around the plant grounds. And it happened 13 times in the matter of days. And that means the reactors are breached. And the fission that usually happens inside is now happening in the open air and around the plant. And in some cases, miles away from the reactors. So I knew then that it was really, really bad and that we have never really had anything like this, considering there were 6 reactors at the site, all these spent fuel pools. So what we found out in the 4 years since is that, TEPCO's kind of trickled this information out over time. They were in complete denial that the reactors had been breached. And then in June of 2011, they admitted, hey, maybe, something did get out of them. Maybe it did leak. And then we find out, there's actually been 3 meltdowns at that site. They've never been contained. There hasn't been any kind of effort like what the Russians did to contain Chernobyl, digging under the plant, putting a top over the plant, which of course is falling apart in Russia. And now they have to build another one to put over the top of their old one. And they've just been, letting this radioactive water flow into the ocean, and they're dumping tons of water on it every day. And they do this every second of every day for these 3 reactors. And there's an enormous amount of groundwater that moves through the site too. And it's making contact with this fuel, and it's all pouring into the Pacific. And, even some of the experts have said, or people who are interviewed by the news, that, well, the Pacific is a big place and it dilutes. And, there's all kinds of reasons not to worry about it, when the fact is, we have 3 uncontained meltdowns going on over there. And this has been going on 24 hours a day. And we're starting to see some of the effects of that. And even people who understood a lot about nuclear energy, who have studied nuclear accidents in the past, who know a lot about how radiation affects health from not only the previous accidents, but things that we've done on purpose, like atmospheric testing during the 50s and 60s and 70s, all the way up to, I think it was 93 was when they did the last one. We know what this does to plankton, to pretty much every stage of the food chain, but we've never had an accident like this one. And now there's some, real indications that this has already reached the West Coast in a big way. And what I mean by that is the California sea lion situation that's going on right now. And this is big news, which I've seen attributed to everything from, El Nino got here early and the ocean's too cold, and no, it's actually too warm, and that's what's killing all these seals. The rescues in California are expecting 35,000 baby seals to be affected by whatever's happening in the seal world, just in over the next few months. And it's worse than it was last year. Last year was worse than the year before, and this first started happening in 2011 with the Alaskan seals, and then it happened in polar bears, and then it happened in walruses, and that was all just the first summer. And, he had seals washing up with, red puffy eyes, and they're bleeding out of, their ears, and their fins are burned, and they're losing hair and lesions. And then, when they analyzed these seals, they found out they were full of tumors. The reason that we know about that, a lot of it is from the indigenous people that live in that area and actually hunt the seals, and had made these observations. And now it's moved down the coast kind of the way the currents do. And we're seeing it as far south as San Diego this year. And it's really, really bad. And it has a lot of people very, very upset, which they should have been really a long time ago when this first started happening. And there's been a gentleman on YouTube who has been saying from the beginning of this, he goes by the name Nibiru Magic, you can't stop the truth from leaking out of Fukushima. And unfortunately, it takes, these giant mortality events for people to get a clue. Maybe there is something going on. We've seen the starfish melting, and the sardines have disappeared. And they've, this week, I think it was, they called it bazillions of crab-like things that had washed ashore that had never been seen before. Dead creatures covering the sand with a sea of red on California beaches. The orcas, their babies aren't surviving. I don't think there was even a single calf that survived this year, and they pay very close attention to the orcas. So, the government and their various, NOAA has been following this, and they've released some information on it. They said they did find radiation in the seals in 2011, but they didn't think it was enough that it would cause these kind of changes. That was the line that they were adhering to. And you go back and you just look at this cover-up that's going on, and it's going up kind of in every aspect of, the fishing industry. They're trying to protect the tourism industry, the seafood industry. There's a lot of money to be lost by news of this nature. And so there's a very concerted, effort to hide what's really happening. And Woods Hole, which is an oceanographic institute that has done plenty of studies, and they receive all kinds of funding from the Department of Defense and a bunch of other, like 10 different government agencies. They have taken over, and they said they've taken it upon themselves to do seawater testing, and they enlist people who live along the West Coast to send them samples of seawater and $500 for them to test the seawater. And it's actually the plankton that we need to be testing, because the buildup of radiation occurs thousands of times higher in plankton than it does in surrounding seawater. So if you want to get, the absolute lowest contamination level possible, you test the seawater, which is what they're doing when what they actually need to be doing is testing the plankton.
And preparing to talk to you today, I went and started checking out just the latest Fukushima news, not stuff from, months ago. I mean, I was looking at the articles and stuff that you've sent, but I just decided to go look today, from the past few days, just to see what was out there. Because it's amazing that even though there is stuff being put out about Fukushima, you just don't hear about it. Not even in the alternative media. It's like become taboo to talk about. It's almost like I think people are afraid to talk about it because nobody's grown a third arm out of the middle of their forehead yet, or a horn. So because there isn't some quick, oh my God, reaction to the radiation, like physiologically with the people there, besides all the cancers and stuff, They're a lot of that's being suppressed, so people are afraid of being called fearmongers now about Fukushima, I think. So they just don't talk about it. I think they don't understand it's one of these slow creeping things, and as each year passes, you're going to see slowly mutations take place and more things. Like you said, all the sea lions, that's one of the things I wanted to bring up. How about the starfish? They're melting. And they're like, oh, it's
Right.
bacteria. Really? I'm 38. I've never seen starfish melt. Now, I know I've only been around 38 years, but I ain't never seen starfish melt into goo. Okay, you can't tell me that's some parasitic bacteria that just happened to come out of nowhere. And maybe it is. Maybe it is some weird parasite. What made it start to liquefy the starfish if it's never done that before? So there's a mutation of some sort. So either the starfish are mutating and melting and reacting to the radiation in the seawater, or the bacteria, quote unquote, that's eating them is reacting to the radiation and mutating and becoming like some sort of monster bacteria, which actually is even more frightening than the radiation melting the starfish. I would kind of expect the radiation to break down the body of the starfish, right? I've seen what my mother died of cancer. Actually, she died more so of the chemo that they gave her. But I've seen what radiation does to the human body. Saw it break her down. So I would almost expect, Christina, for the starfish to melt. But the thought that the bacteria or whatever it is, fungus or whatever it is they say they got, the thought that could have been something that was completely normal that the starfish deal with, and usually their bodies could fight it off. But if this stuff was mutated by radiation, what if they created? It could be like the Godzilla of bacteria in the sea. That's kind of frightening.
Yeah, and we know that radiation already does this to bacteria and viruses, and that's been known like for a long time. And you say, wow, I've never heard of starfish melting before. The people who study starfish and have studied starfish their whole lives had never heard of it happening before either. And there's a couple things that make the starfish situation unique. One is that starfish actually take in seawater and use it kind of like blood. Seawater is like circulating through their body. And the second thing is that they feed on like oysters and clams and things like that are filter feeders, things that don't move. They stay there, they filter the water, and they're very close to clay bottoms. And because of the electrical charge that's in radiation, it's attracted to clay. And also, it is found in much higher levels in things like oysters, in things like clams, because of this filtering process. And in fact, there was a document, a PDF that was released in 2011 where they had tested the Alaskan seashore, and they tested rockfish, and they tested all these different kinds of mussels and things like that, and they found contamination in all of those things, but it was much, much higher in things that were filter feeders. So this is directly what the starfish are feeding on. So you have this like dynamic going on in the food chain that would make them more susceptible to it.
I didn't know that they actually used the seawater like blood, but I mean that would make, I mean that they're just, it's like they're getting chemo. The starfish are getting seawater chemo. That's
right.
It's ridiculous.
I never thought about it that way, but yeah, that's kind of what it's like.
Wow, saltwater chemo. Thank you, Fukushima and TEPCO. Keep lying, by the way, guys. I read an article about how much money, I saw this earlier. Like I said, I was just randomly going, I was like, Fukushima 2015, March 26th. Boof. This just like litany of articles comes up, and I'm like, how come none of this ever appears anywhere? No one talks about this. So the one article said they wasted, I think it was half $500 million, I think, or something like that. They wasted, or a third, however much money has been put forward to clean up Fukushima to date, right today, till March 26, 2015. However much money to the cent has been put forward, they said something like a third of it was pissed away on stuff that just will not work. Like they spent almost $1 million trying to create that quote unquote ice wall, which didn't work. They ended up just pumping cement into it.
Yeah.
Like, guys, what is wrong with you people?
Yeah, and the decontamination doesn't work either. You know, they put it in plastic bags and have it piled up in almost like pyramids all over the place in Japan, and the bags only have a life of 3 years. And so a lot of these bags, there's like these massive weeds growing out of them, and they're splitting open, and the stuff is just, going into the groundwater now in a completely different location because it's been bagged up from communities that they're supposedly trying to decontaminate so they can move people back into them. And they're, hauling it to different parts of Japan. And now they're contaminating those areas because the bags are breaking open. It is just complete insanity. But somebody's getting really rich over this decontamination BS.
It's ridiculous. I was reading one of the things they said that, and of course the article, kind of made it out like, oh, it was because they're bumbling and because they're rushing and trying to do stuff. And they do mention that there was never any cleanup plans ever before the leak. So it's like the oil industry. Hey, we're going to do this really dangerous process, which could result in this big mess, but we're not going to have a contingency plan for this big mess until, of course, the big mess occurs and we screw everything up. And then we're going to go, oops. And then we're just going to spray chemicals and sink all the oil into the Gulf of Mexico, which is all sitting out there. And they're doing the same kind of lackadaisical, whatever, with this.
Right.
Look, the solution to pollution is not what is it? Did they say the solution to pollution is dilution? So, yeah, it's not the solution to pollution, okay? You can't just take radioactive seawater or regular radioactive non-seawater and dump it into this clean, non-radioactive seawater and expect that that's not going to get it radioactive. Radioactive particles don't go into the seawater and go, oh, I'm melting like sugar. That's not how it works. This is the problem. People are too simplified in their thinking. They think that, the government has convinced people that whatever they say is accurate. Right after the explosion happened and this leak happened, the EPA raised the allowable radiation levels, that they would allow in food and everything else. Wait, what? But how is that the answer to a nuke plant leaking? Well, we'll just raise the acceptable limits. That's not solving a problem.
Yeah, they do that. They do that all over the world. They did it after Chernobyl, too. They did it with reindeer in Lapland, which is a huge part of the diet of the people that live there. And these reindeer were so contaminated from Chernobyl. And so the government just upped it by 10 times so that they could say, okay, you can eat the reindeer, and they do this all the time. This stuff is so typical from accident to accident. They just take, the same page out of, they take a page out of the same book in the way that they deal with it. And when you go back and you look at it, it's just incredible. Chernobyl wasn't that long ago that people shouldn't remember this. And the same thing with 3 Mile Island. We have the anniversary of that. We have the Chernobyl accident, which is next month. And, you'll see it in the news sometimes Al Jazeera or Press TV. They'll run a special on it, maybe RT, but even RT has gotten away from it. They used to cover Fukushima quite a bit, and now I don't see them doing it at all. And there was a gentleman on YouTube who goes by the name of Thor, or the real Thor, and he monitored his Twitter feed on the 4-year anniversary of Fukushima to see how many mainstream articles ran or how many tweets there were, and there wasn't a single one in 7 hours. And he has a video up where it's half an hour of him just reading through 7 hours of Twitter from all of the mainstream sources, and there's no mention of Fukushima at all.
That's why in the intro I said Fuku what?
Yeah.
Fuku who?
I get that all the time. And Miss Milky the Clown, she's another researcher. She lives by me, and I'm very lucky to have her as a good friend. She gets that all the time, too. Fuku what? That's exactly what they say.
Yeah, they don't know what you're talking about.
No idea.
No, you're that leaking nuke plant from Japan. Oh, they fixed that. I'm no, they didn't. What do you mean they didn't? Do you pay attention to anything? And then, I didn't see it in the news, and I'm like, well, you're not going to see it in the mainstream. And then I thought about it, and I was like, you know what? They're not going to see it in the alternative media either, because nobody's really talking about this. And I think it's for fear of being called a fearmonger, because as I said, Nobody's grown a horn yet. But that doesn't mean that we're not being affected by this on a very, small microscopic level, like at our DNA. I mean, that's where mutation in cancer comes from, at the DNA level. So that's where the radiation affects you too. All I'm going to say is, if you research it, ladies and gentlemen, you will see that there's a spike in cancer cases in Japan. I know they'll tell you that that's not true and that nobody has cancer in Japan. And Ann Coulter went on Fox News. I mean, when you make Bill O'Reilly give you a face palm and uncomfortable, you know you're doing something wrong. She was on his show and said all the people in Japan should be happy that they got exposed to radiation because now they won't get cancer. Because dipshit thinks that because chemo is given to cancer patients here, that the radioactive exposure from the plant will keep everybody from get cancer in Japan. Very good, Ann Coulter. And these are the talking heads that they put out there. And unfortunately, because people are too busy in their everyday lives, Christina, and we know the whole spiel about that, they're not paying attention to this. And that's why, first of all, because we got the break sneaking up on us in about a minute, but I want to say thank you, because you are one of the very few researchers that has stayed with all the other craziness that goes on. And you don't just research this. You pay attention to everything. But this is your area of expertise. And honestly, if we didn't have you and Miss Milky and a couple other people out there, and those who are not named, if you research Fukushima, you're appreciated. Just know that, okay? If you hear this later on, just know you're appreciated, because everything you guys do is what's giving us information. Because, the alternative media really, unfortunately, has dropped the ball on this. The mainstream media obviously has dropped the ball on it. RT, all of them have dropped the ball, and I think a lot of it has to do with being afraid of being called a fearmonger. Anyway, I'm going to pause us right there. Ladies and gentlemen, break sneaking up. We'll be right back. When we get back, I'm going to have Christina plug her websites and YouTube channels, Twitter, Facebook, and everything else. And then we're going to get into the West Coast and the effects this is having on it. Stay tuned. We are back, ladies and gentlemen. So getting right back into it, because we only have 2 hours, right? Yeah. Well, now we have like an hour and a half left. So, and 2 hours, by the way, is not enough time to discuss this. I know Christina is going to be coming back on. I'm going to be bringing her back on more regularly to do Fukushima updates and stuff, because I think this needs to be talked about more. And instead of me just chastising everybody else for not talking about it and then not talking about it myself, because that would be pretty two-faced, I'm going to be bringing her back on more often to discuss this and put this back out into the general discussion sphere, and hopefully other people will pick up on it and do the same, and she will be back on more radio shows and be doing more interviews, as she should have been doing. And that's not her fault. That's our fault, ladies and gentlemen. I'm speaking to my fellow brothers and sisters here in the independent, alternative, whatever the frig you want to call it, community. We shouldn't rely on the mainstream to pick up on this, and we shouldn't be worried about being called fearmongers. As long as you're not selling iodine or some other sort of enhancement, tincture or pill in order to, fight off the radiation exposure. If you're just talking about the truth and you actually know what's going on, don't be afraid of being called a fearmonger. Because when everybody's dropping dead around us of cancers and everything else, it's a little too late, right? So this needs to be discussed. Now, getting back into it, Christina, I got questions from the chat room that kind of correlate with some of the stuff that I want to talk about next.
Sure.
And make sure, ladies and gentlemen, you stay tuned for hour 2, because we're going to get into that plane crash too that happened. Because Christina's got some interesting research into the actual effects of flying through the plumes and stuff because the stuff's still floating around the atmosphere, and all this commercial jet traffic is flying through it. So she's got some interesting research on that. So make sure you stay tuned for hour 2. But to get to the questions from the chat and to the next piece I wanted to talk about, because I wanted to talk to you about the West Coast. I have a lot of listeners in California. I have friends and loved ones in California, and if it's not being talked about, if people don't know that California is getting bathed in radiation, then the people out there are not knowing that they're getting bathed in radiation, and B, a lot of our veggies and fruit, as shown by this California drought, comes from California. So you have to worry about the stuff that you're eating over here on the East Coast that comes from California too. And the other half of that, and I'll give you the floor and let you take as long as you need to answer it. West Coast, and people have asked me about the Southern Hemisphere and all the Pacific Islands and stuff down in the lower, down south of Japan and down around like Australia and all around there. If that's safe to be in because it's in the southern hemisphere as opposed to where Japan is, and then the exposure to the west coast. So you can pick up either one of those two, and the floor is yours.
Okay, well, we do have a couple of great researchers in that area of the world. Rose in New Zealand, Citizen Perth from Australia, and Peter Daly, who checks rainwater, food samples, and has been doing so for, I think, pretty much 4 years straight. And I get emails from Peter almost on a weekly basis. And Australia had kind of a unique storm situation recently. They had like 2 cyclones in a row that hit there, and both of them registered much higher readings than what they normally tend to see in rainstorms. And some of that can be from radon in the ground. Of course, there's a lot of uranium mining that's going on too that gets volatilized into the atmosphere. And but these storm systems came from the more northern part of the Pacific, and what Peter had picked up were some of the highest readings that he's ever gotten down there through one of these cyclones. So I keep an eye on it. I'm not as worried about those guys down there as I am about the people up here. Of course, the situation's going to be worse in Southeast Asia, especially in areas where they have very significant rainfall. And I'm talking like where we've seen a lot of planes go down recently, Taiwan, the Malaysian flight, not the one that disappeared, but the other Air Asia flight that happened December 28th. They're flying through these radioactive rainstorms, and that can be affecting the metal, the electrical components, and everything on these planes. But this, the circulation from the Pacific is going to go everywhere. We're seeing more evidence of it, whether we're looking at mutations, whether we're looking at, the death of different types of species or unusual mortality events. And we're getting early reports too of like sickness in the populations, and it's going to start from Japan, and it's pretty much going to concentrate around the Pacific Rim first, but we will also see that in areas of the country that receive higher rainfall. And I mean, in terms of the United States, I'm talking about the northern tier and especially the Midwest, because we have a lot of humidity in this area because of the Great Lakes. And that actually helps pull some of that fallout down from the air columns. And the fallout that was released and is continuing to be released from Fukushima is making its way around the northern hemisphere in a couple of different ways. At the start of the accident, it was more in a gas form. And in fact, there was a story that came out just this week from a government model that showed that radioactive gas around Tokyo skyrocketed to 10 billion times normal levels right after 3/11, but very high concentrations were recorded at every monitoring post in the northern hemisphere, every single one. So, our air is all connected. Eventually, it makes its way down into the southern hemisphere too. And then we've also had particle releases from the explosions, and there were multiple explosions at that site. And then the releases from the meltdowns that are occurring now underneath the reactors, in the ground underneath the plant. These things are still hot. In at least one case, we know it's still molten. Probably all three, though. And this stuff waxes and wanes and releases like clouds of radiation on a continuous basis. And we know this is happening because of like iodine measurements that happen in the sludge around Japan. So this is evidence of like new, fresh fission going on. We don't know exactly where it's coming from because we don't have a good view of anything happening really on site at that plant, except for what TEPCO tells us, or, underground at the plant. And then this water pouring that goes into the Pacific, all the storms that are generated out of the Pacific, can pick this radiation up through the water cycle, and then that gets dumped over here when it rains out across the U.S. And this happened all the time during bomb testing. This was the basis for one of the best books ever written about how fallout works and the cover-ups that happen to keep it from people. And the book was called Secret Fallout by Dr. Ernest Sternglass. And I had been trying to get a hold of Dr. Sternglass in the weeks before the 4-year anniversary, because I really wanted to do a show with him and Loren. Loren was very, very close to him, Loren Murray. And unfortunately, he died just a few weeks before that anniversary. And my emails were coming back that account had been closed. And I'm like, oh no, what's going on? Because, I mean, there's very few people who can talk about this and talk about it in an intelligent way that have the background of working for the government, working, during the Manhattan Project or for the Manhattan Project, or working at a nuke lab, becoming a whistleblower. There's very few people around. Some of them are getting a lot older, and I don't know who is going to replace these people when they're gone. Everybody's so corrupt now. And if you're a smart person and you're, in high school and you figure out a way to make some kind of new engine, you better know that the government knows about you and is probably already actively recruiting you to work for them or to help guide your secondary education and later your career, so that they can keep people from you from going public. I know people that this has happened to, and this is how Michio Kaku got to be where he is. He was actually a child in a prisoner of war camp in the U.S. post World War II, and they recognized that he was extremely intelligent. And so the U.S. government was pretty much in charge of his education and career ever since that point. And, he's a pretty extreme example, but this happens all the time. And who are we going to get to talk about this? People really just have to take it upon themselves to educate themselves and to be healthier and learn how a lot of this works, so you know what to avoid and what the signs are to look for if you are getting sick or people that you care about are getting sick. And that's kind of where we're at with this. And I'd always hoped we're going to reach someone who's in a position of power, who will actually speak about it, and, who has a very wide audience and can get the word out and maybe generate more interest in the subject. And it just really isn't happening the way that I had hoped that it would. And a lot of it is just because there's so much corruption everywhere. It's in every industry. It's certainly in our healthcare industry. And I have firsthand knowledge of that, having worked in that field for 24 years. But it's really every industry. The corporate interests are the only ones protected. And as you and I were talking about during break, they want us sick. We're just easier to control that way. And we make more money for them, because then you become part of the whole healthcare industrial complex. And once you get into that, it's very hard to get out of, especially nowadays.
And I agree totally that part of the major problem is this next younger generation of scientists and supposedly independent free thinkers and outside the box thinkers, like supposed, free thinking physicist, or theoretical physicist Michio Kaku, who I do not like. I think the guy's a total shill, but he himself, because he's controlled, right? So he says what he's supposed to say. Even he was freaked out by Fukushima. Just so people know, okay? He's not talking about it now, but if you go back and listen to when he did interviews about Fukushima, you could see even he was freaked out by it in the beginning. Now, I don't know where I honestly don't know where he stands on it now. It would not surprise me if he towed the party line now, because he has with everything else. He's actually known for that. And I don't think it's actually an extreme example to bring him up. I think it's a perfect example, because guys like that are what's replacing these older individuals, these real researchers who are all dying off, and they know that. They being the powers that shouldn't be. They think in the long game, Christina. They don't plan for 5 years, 10 years. They think 15, 20, 30 years. And remember, it's a whole new generation of younger people running things now. David Rockefeller is only mastering not crapping on himself. The guy's 99 years old, and he has a colostomy bag. He's not running things anymore. He's only a name, a name or a figure in name only, I should say. He's not anything more than that, but it's like his children and their children that you need to wonder about, because they're younger, they understand how things work, they're thinking about the next 30 or 40 years, and that's how they operate. And we need to think in the same fashion in order to be able to understand how things are going. I mean, first of all, let me say, it's insane that we build these nuke plants anywhere near fault lines. Does that even need to be pointed out? And I'm not a nuke physicist. I am not a scientist. I don't have a PhD, and I graduated trade school in 2 different things. I've certified in many different things. None of them are doctorates. But you know what? It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that building a nuclear power plant anywhere near a fault line, or perhaps even close to where tsunamis could hit it, is a bad idea. I don't understand why people think this is a good idea. Some of the brightest people in the world, you have to question why they would even do this, and why the general public would not be like, yo, okay, this is scary, we need to stop. Fukushima should be an example, but it's amazing how much power and influence that the nuke industry has, plus obviously a lot of those people are part of this power structure. It's amazing how much influence that they have, and how much can be bought with money, because nobody talks about it anymore. Everybody was for the first year, maybe 2 years, people were talking about it, but now it's just like a non-thing. It's Fuku what? No one cares anymore. That is pretty frightening. So you have to educate yourself. I mean, the government's lying about it through their teeth. Look at the sailors on the Ronald Reagan, Christina.
Yeah.
Those men and women, they're all getting thyroid cancer. They're all getting sick. Some of them have died. They have, some of them are getting heart conditions and all these other physiological conditions. And a lot of this stuff, when you research it, if not all of it, can be traced back to high levels of radiation exposure. And the government's like, no, you're fine. You went through a plume, but you're fine. Shh.
Yeah, it's really terrible what's happened to them in particular. And there's been a few of them, too, who've gone on and had children since then, and the babies have been born with birth defects. And now they're part of this lawsuit as well. But there were 70,000 active service members in that region when those plants were exploding. Not just the guys that were on all the ships. And it wasn't just one ship. It was like a couple of carriers besides the Reagan, a bunch of support ships, and all the helicopters that were flying from the ships into shore and bringing the blankets and the water and the stuff for the people who had been displaced, and, their homes were destroyed. And, they thought they were doing a good thing. And then they all start getting sick. And, there was a lot of weirdness going on the ship. And then they wanted to dock because so many of the sailors were sick on these ships, and nobody would let them into port in any of the countries in that region because they knew the ships were radioactive.
How crazy is that? That nobody would let them pull into port. But hey, there's nothing wrong with there's nothing. You don't talk about that. You don't have any radiation poisoning. No, you just shut up and die, vet. That's basically what they're doing. They don't care. I mean, if this isn't the most anti-recruiting ad you could possibly ever have for not joining the military, it would be, go look at what happened to the U.S. Navy personnel and the U.S. Marine Corps personnel and Air Force and any Army personnel that were over there too, or Coast Guardsmen, because I know all 5 of them, all 5 branches are all over around that area. So, whoever, I mean, what you're told is only a fraction of who was actually exposed. And I think you actually brought that point up very very well. It wasn't just the Reagan. I mean, it was, if the Reagan was exposed. Remember, the Reagan is part of a carrier group, a battle group. There's other ships with them. They don't just let Mama Bear go off by herself unprotected. A carrier only has its planes and any helicopters for protection. It doesn't. It would need other ships. So yeah, you're right. All those other sailors are exposed too. That's horrible. And Marines and anybody else on board the ships, civilians too.
Yeah, and the Geigers were just screaming when these guys came back into the ship and they had to go through decontamination. And their decontamination protocol wasn't followed. We have video of what was going on in those rooms. And I mean, the Geigers are just going off like crazy as they're running the probes over their vests and their helmets and their boots. And they were just stripping off their clothes and throwing it into a big pile in the room. And so they were basically scattering this radiation now into the air too, which they're breathing in again, although they were already breathing in when they were, on the deck of the ship and when they were flying through the plumes, or actually being, on shore with some of their rescue missions. But, it's even people that are just at bases, some of their children and the wives or, girlfriends of some of the service members. I think you have to be married, though, to live on the base together. They were getting sick, too, and they never even went in the region. They were just on the main island of Japan. So we have kind of that focus group, and it spreads out from there. And they're in this huge lawsuit now against TEPCO to try to get TEPCO to actually put together a fund for their medical costs, which are just going to be astronomical. These guys were exposed to MOX fuel at close range, but MOX fuel particles were also picked up in air filters in Norway during that time, and those particles blew over us in the States. So there's a lot of people that probably inhaled that here too.
Do you have a map, or is there a map, I should say, that shows which states have been the most heavily affected by the fallout from Fukushima?
We have a map for the first year, I believe, where it shows the excess mortality, and it was 100,000 above what was expected. 100,000 deaths, and I don't recall where primarily the most amount of deaths were, but it's broken down by region, which is the same way that the CDC gets the information sent in from the health departments. And the Midwest was pretty high, and I'm pretty sure the Pacific Northwest was too. And I'd have to look. It's been a while since I've looked at that map. And since then, since December of 2011, we really haven't had any updated stats from the CDC or from the National Institutes of Health that show what's happened since. And what we're particularly interested in seeing are the type of cancers that we know are caused by radiation exposure. Lung cancer, brain cancer, kidneys and eye, places where you have high circulation in the body, and then pancreatic cancer, rare tumors in children. Really need to see what's happened with all of those things. And normally that data is sent via the health departments every week to the CDC that puts it into documents, and then it's available for doctors to use for their research papers and articles and so forth, or whatever industry is looking to see what they need to cover up that week or that month. And we haven't had really any recent stats since 2011, which is highly unusual. And when I talk to physicians that live just in my area of the country, or, occasionally I'll speak to someone on the West Coast that calls me, they'll hear an interview and they want to talk to me directly, or I'll see an interview that they did and I contact them because I want to tell them, hey, this is something else that you need to know about that's going on, because I'm pretty sure that you don't. What I'm hearing from them is that they have had a significant increase in the amount of cancers, and also in the amount of cancers being diagnosed in younger patients. And in younger patients, especially women, because you have a lot of estrogen and stuff that's going on in your body, cancers get fed really quickly and they grow like crazy, faster than they do in an older person. But then you also have to worry about like people who are immune compromised, because if your immune system isn't functioning properly, and that's another like huge thing, probably like my number one concern of how radiation affects people's health, is that your immune system just doesn't work the way that it's supposed to. And that's what keeps cancer in check and a lot of other conditions in the body. So that's really the best thing that you can do to like protect yourself, is by doing things that would boost your immune system. But, you know, if we all breathed in, you know, particles, especially in the first couple weeks and months when that was going on, I don't know how that will really help us all in the long term, but we have to kind of like try where we can and just keep checking to see where the data falls out. And if we don't have the data, then we need to rely on some of this intel that we get from people in the medical profession. And, you know, try to do an analysis on that.
I gotta tell you, if it's the worst case scenario, and everybody, the food, everything is screwed. But let's say that the worst case scenario people are correct, and that okay, we're all done. In 50 years, life as we know it is not going to be 30 years, life as we know it won't be normal. Well, then maybe that's why they don't want the general public to know, because if the general public realized that everything was going to drastically change, perhaps their perspective on everything would drastically change. And people would say, well, what are they worried about, them freaking out and rioting? No, what if that was like the tipping point for mankind? And mankind was like, well, we need to, if we're going to survive through this drastic change that's coming, okay, we can't stop it from coming, but what we can do is, perhaps ride over top of the wave like you would if you see a massive tsunami wave coming at you. Quite often, if you can get up over the top of the wave before it crests, then you're okay. You've made it up over the other side, and your ship or boat will ride down the other side, hopefully, in theory. And it's been done by ships before. Well, it's the same thing. We could perhaps see this tsunami wave coming 30 years out and ride up over top of it. But if that happens, then they become irrelevant and they lose their power structure, they lose their money, they lose their control. Their whole agenda would fall apart simply because of this event and perhaps the perspective shift it could cause in mankind. So perhaps maybe that's another reason why they don't want people to know the drastic effects that this is having and is going to have. I can't believe that people don't realize that this is a bad thing. I mean, general science tells us that radiation is bad, but hey, I guess I'm silly because this is one of those things that keeps me up at night. When people ask me what keeps me up at night, like, Popeye, do you fear things? I wouldn't consider it fear. The things that keep me up at night, like Fukushima and stuff, they keep me up at night because my brain is constantly mulling them over and trying to figure out a way to solve it or a way around it. And Fukushima is one of those things that I don't think there's a way around it. We're just going to have to adapt to what's coming. Anyway, top of the hour break sneaking up on us. Ladies and gentlemen, do not go anywhere. Hour number 2 coming up. We're going to get into radiation exposure in flight because of this and more. And we're gonna get into this plane crash that happened in France. Talk about that in regards to this exposure. So stay tuned. Interesting second hour coming up. Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with hour number 2 here on tonight's live edition of Down the Rabbit Hole. I am your host, Popeye from FederalJack.com. It is March 26th, 2015. We are hanging out with Christina Consolo, a.k.a. RadChick, tonight, discussing Fukushima. Just in case you missed the first hour and you are just joining us here in hour number 2, make sure you go back in the archives and listen. If you don't know what Fukushima is, I'm sure some of you who are just joining might have went, Fuku what? Fuku who? Fuku where? Like I said in hour 1, well, go back and listen to the first hour if you're not sure what Fukushima is. Because we only have an hour left, and there's a ton of stuff to get into, so I don't want to rewind and repeat myself, especially if you've been listening to the whole show. So if you're just joining us, as I always tell you, go back either to Truth Frequency Radio and listen to the archives, or you can always go over to PopeyeRadio.com and download the commercial-free archive in high quality to whatever device that you choose to listen to it on for yourself. So getting back into hour number 2, before we get into the information, because I did promise in the first hour I would have Christina plug her stuff, and we always get into information. Christina and I have this thing where we start talking and we forget about doing things like that. So, and I have a habit of doing that myself anyway. So, before we get back into it, because I know I will forget, Christina, go ahead and plug anything you wish. Websites, YouTube channels, Twitter, Facebook, anything.
Well, pretty much all my links are at Climate Viewer News. It's Jim Lee's mapping website, and we cover mostly like chemtrails, radiation, nuke plants, pollution issues, and surveillance. And so there's some great articles up there, and you can search out the authors independently. You can look at Jim's maps. Every time I post one of his maps, like I get this crazy like viral thing that happens to wherever I posted it. And then I've got a Twitter account, RadChick Forecast. But all my links are at that website. If you just search Climate Viewer News, RadChick, you can find my links, latest video uploads, my Twitter feed, Facebook pages. It's all there.
Awesome. People, follow her, pay attention. Again, Christina, thank you for doing the research that you do, because there's not many people looking into this. So I'm glad that we have a few people looking into it, and not just people, bloviating on YouTube trying to scare the crap out of people to get hits, because they have monetized videos or anything like that. I know, I've known you for years. You really do care about people. You do this because you genuinely give a crap. So a big thank you from everybody, and a big thank you from me. So let's get into the radiation in the atmosphere. Now, this stuff is still floating around, correct? Let's start off with the basics. The hydrogen explosion, it threw a bunch of crap up into the atmosphere. But that's not just the only radiation. The stuff that's constantly leaking out that we can't even see with our visual eyes. There's still stuff leaking out into the seawater and into the air, which is obviously getting up into the atmosphere. So I guess to start with, explain the level of contamination in the atmosphere, what's in it, and if you could, if you want, you can explain the definition of the measurements, so people kind of understand why, if you throw out a number, like what that number means, and why it's so shocking to the people that understand. Because I think if they understood the units of measurement and exposure and stuff to what's in the atmosphere, as opposed to what we're supposed to, quote unquote, what used to be, I don't want to say what it is now, but what used to be the acceptable limit. There shouldn't be any acceptable limit of radiation exposure to the human body, because any of it is bad. Let's just say that. It's all cumulative, but I digress. So anyway, go ahead and pick up anywhere you want with that, and just explain to the audience pretty much the atmosphere and the exposure to it, and then we can get into the air travel, because that's interesting in and of itself.
Well, since the accident happened, there's approximately 2,000 different elements and isotopes that were formed that were released to the environment. None of them were ever meant to leave the confines of a nuclear reactor. And whenever you get a number, and it's why it's really hard to talk about numbers too, but will sometimes help if you do like one or two things, and then the person can kind of extrapolate for themselves. This latest article about the 10 billion times limit of radioactive gas that was around Tokyo. That was just the gas. That wasn't particles. That was, I believe it was iodine-131, which is something that's short-lived. And when you have radiation, there's like this type of radiation that decays really quickly, and then there's a type that stays around for a really long time. And then there's a whole gamut of in-betweens. And to help people, I guess, visualize this the best, the ones that are short-lived are also the worst. They're the strongest. They're the ones that are going to affect people the most. And in the case of iodine, which is the one that we always worry about with people's thyroids, that completely, it has like an 8-day half-life. And we know that this went all over the Northern Hemisphere. We have all kinds of simulations, and we have measurements from some countries that shared them. And there were even some reports from, I think, 2 states that had picked it up in their rain and reported it. We had some EPA tests that found it in milk because it lands on the grass and the cows eat the grass. And then it goes into the cow and comes out in their milk, or it goes into the meat. And in the case of iodine, within 40 days, all that has decayed. But what it's touched has had a substantial effect. And then there's another type of iodine, 129. We'll use those as the two examples because you probably hear about them more than some of the other ones. And that one lasts like billions of years. I think it's 4.5 billion years, maybe, give or take a few billion years. And that one, is not as harmful, even though it sounds really, really bad because it's around for so long. If you were exposed to it, it would be nothing like getting exposed to the 131 type. So, I know that's all like really confusing and everything, but iodine is just what we're concerned with when we talk about thyroid. We're not talking about the other, almost 2,000 different ones that were released at the same time too. So when you start thinking in those terms, it's like, wow, that's when it starts getting really mind-boggling. And we know how some of these things will act because they've been studied for a really, really long time. And we know that cesium will go to the heart and the kidneys. And we know that strontium will go to the bones, but it also affects other organs. And this has all been very carefully studied, again, from past reactor accidents and from this horrendous legacy of atmospheric bomb testing that we did. Sorry for the barking dog.
That's okay. I have a snoring one too in the background, so don't worry. Go on.
So, when we're looking for, because we can't see this stuff, and because the type of instruments that we can buy, that we can actually afford, that are, less than $1,000, only pick up maybe 5 to 15% of what's really there. You need to have like a $3,000 to $10,000 version to really get a better idea, and one that costs many, many times that to know exactly what's there. There's really no chance of any of us ever really knowing for ourselves by any test that we could do because we don't have the equipment. And the government does have the equipment, though. In fact, they went around and they took those expensive pieces of equipment out of major universities in the weeks following the accident because they didn't want anybody using them. So what you have to look at next, in the absence of that type of data, is what are we noticing in the environment? Are there things that have changed from 2011 to now? And one of the things that I had picked up on early was that I was starting to see like mutations in plants where I live, which is southeast Michigan. And so I started kind of going around with a camera and looking, and the more I looked, the more I found. And so I had a pretty good following already on social media, and I started putting out requests. Hey, if you see anything funny in your garden or in your crops or, on your balcony and your planters, take a picture of it and send it to me, and we'll just start collecting them. And within the first 12 months, I had over 1,000 images, and I was starting to get people contacting me from the West Coast that worked for botanical gardens that were seeing things that they've never seen before. And it's like, whoa, okay, that's a little more than I was expecting to see happen. And then we took a look at babies, and we start looking at infant mortality. And infant mortality went up considerably in the first couple months after the Fukushima accident. And then there's been some analysis, too, that these babies had babies that were born particularly in the 5 West Coast states, Hawaii, Alaska, Washington, Oregon, and California, had measurable radioactive fallout in their thyroids. And it was only done on those 5 states. And Christopher Busby actually wrote about this for the Radiation and Public Health Project. And there's an article, I think it might be on Ecology News, that you can see where that was analyzed. And then nothing's really been done since then. So we keep tracking, mutations, and I have a page for that, and people send me stuff all the time, but we have to always look at what happened before and what's happening now, and did it change in 2011? And then we started finding something really curious, and that was pilots passing out while they were flying planes. And there were a couple of big stories where this happened. One, both pilots passed out at the same time in the UK flying an aircraft. Pilots having seizures, having heart attacks. And so I started looking into this and found through using a variety of sources, because it's difficult information to come by. The NTSB, the National Transportation and Safety Bureau, does not keep these kind of statistics unless something results in a crash. And you're probably wondering, how's this getting to Germanwings? But you're going to see the connection here in a moment. So we had this, we start searching through the archives using the Wayback Machine, using every source that we could find. And there were actually 6 documented cases of pilots passing out while they're flying a plane since 2004. And that was 7 years before Fukushima happened. And we had 17 events involving 19 different pilots in the past 3 years after Fukushima happened. And that did not include 11 military pilots that passed out flying F-22s. That was something that might be in a whole different category, because there was an issue with the type of vests that they were wearing. So I dropped that data out of it, but we had 6 before in 7 years and 19 in 3 years' time. And so I presented this information. I did a lengthy interview with Alfred Weber of Exopolitics about this. And I just started getting intel from just all over the place, from people who worked in the industry. There was a situation that happened with Alaskan Air where flight crews were getting all these like rashes and weird skin problems, and their hair was falling out. And they said, oh, it must be with what, we're cleaning the uniforms with. And so that was going on around the same time. And so as I'm looking through all this data, I'm sending it to people that I really, really trust with this information. Some people that I know that work in the industry, some of them who I know since childhood. And what one of them said to me in particular is, you need to start looking at the planes falling apart, because the same mechanism of the way the radiation is affecting people, and we know that there's contamination in the atmosphere. There's still contamination from bomb testing in the upper atmosphere. We know that, we get cosmic radiation from the sun. So that's already affecting them. Pilots and flight crews have a much higher incidence of getting skin cancer and breast cancer. And now it sounds like brain cancer too, because that's been happening a lot. But the same kind of mechanism where there's this decay of a radioactive atom, it breaks off into 2 new atoms, and then there's an electron charge that will affect any kind of materials that is around it. And it's called the Wigner effect, or Wigner effect. And it was named after a guy who worked for the government, who did all kinds of research on this at, I believe it was Oak Ridge Labs in Tennessee, post-World War II. And they know that it happens in reactors. They know that it happens at nuke plants all over the place, because there's so much, radiation that's coming out of these places. The pipes break down and the concrete falls apart, and sometimes the reactors even crack. And in Belgium, they found out recently that one set of reactors in particular had 16,000 cracks in just one reactor vessel. And it's this effect of this Wigner effect that causes this. And I thought, could this possibly be happening in planes too? I mean, this would just be something I would have never occurred to me to study if I hadn't already known that the pilots were passing out and having seizures and heart attacks, much more than they had in the past before Fukushima. So we started tracking those events. And I did a fairly lengthy interview with Dr. Loren Murray, who has worked with Doug Roque, who you've had on your show about DU and the effect that it has on soldiers. And we broke this down and tried to lay it out in its like very understandable history, starting with like what has happened in the nuke industry that explains this. what has happened with the Fukushima accident, and now what are we seeing happening in planes. And when you're flying at altitude, the radiation is much higher up at altitude than it is on the ground. And part of that is due to cosmic sources. And I've actually flown a couple times since Fukushima happened with a Geiger, and I was just like astounded at the levels that I was getting, because I knew they were high, but I wasn't expecting them to be as high as they were. And so other researchers have done this too, and there has been a few that have even had their Geigers confiscated by TSA before they board a plane. They don't want you taking Geigers on planes anymore. And really what we need to do is have every plane outfitted with these.
Is there a law against it, though?
Not that I know of.
I mean, isn't it technically just another
Patriot Act thing?
Isn't it like just... Well, I mean, it's not a bomb, and they know it's a Geiger counter. I mean, is there... what are they going to try to charge you with? Well, you're trying to cause panic? No. It's an indicator. I want to know how much radiation I'm being exposed to. Other people have their laptop. How come they can have that? You can scan my Geiger counter, put it through the X-ray machine. Of course, it'll probably... I wonder if that would screw a Geiger counter up if putting it through the X-ray machine, actually. I wonder if like their little scanning procedures would end up damaging it and making it a moot point to even bring it aboard the airplane to begin with.
Yeah, I would definitely recalibrate the Geiger if I was going to do that, but that means I'd need to have a radioactive source, which I know I can't get through TSA. You know, I've got like little pieces of uranium and stuff like that and lead boxes to calibrate my Geiger, so that would be a problem, sending it through that. But we started then getting also, and we're looking at all this data, and I mean, in case you do watch the news, you may have noticed that we've had 3 major airliners go down in the last 87 days. And all of them weird, and now this latest one, they are attributing to the pilot went crazy and locked the other pilot out of the cockpit and purposely crashed the plane into a mountainside. And so after the years of bomb testing, there was a researcher, he's actually a professor from San Jose State University. I think his last name is Pellegrini. And he was an associate of Ernest Sternglass, too. And he actually linked aggression and crime to fallout in cities downwind of nuke explosions during bomb testing. And what he said in this paper is that the effect of radiation exposure worked on the brain in the same way. We know that it affects the part of the brain, the executive complex, that keeps you from like doing crazy stuff and controlling impulses and possibly being suicidal on a plane, or, you know, any kind of other acts. And there's been a number of these that have happened in the recent past. I mean, it happens from time to time, sure, and people drink on the planes and stuff like that. But lately, there's been some weird ones. And the people who fly more often are going to be affected more by this. It can cause like seizure-like activity in the brain where the person almost can't function or have like rational thought. Paris Hilton's little brother, and a lot of people heard about this, he was arrested for going insane on a 10-hour flight and threatening to effing kill the passengers and flight attendants. This happened in July of last year. In November, the CEO of Korean Airlines, his daughter, who's also an executive, or I'm sorry, she was the vice president at Korean Air, wigged out on a plane because somebody handed her a bag of nuts instead of putting it on a plate like they're supposed to. She's resigned from her post, and they were even discussing bringing charges against her. And the lead singer of the Cranberries was arrested on a flight from JFK to Ireland, I believe. She was flying over the Atlantic. She flipped out on a plane. This was also in November, and assaulted 2 flight attendants, breaking one of the foots of one of them. The person had to be hospitalized. More recent, there were a couple of cops that were coming back from a funeral for an NYPD officer. And during the flight, there was a woman who became suicidal. They had to restrain her. While they were trying to restrain her, there was a cancer doc who tried to help. She bit his hand. They had to pry her jaws open to get his hand out of her mouth. And one of the officers described this as being a street fight at 30,000 feet. In Air India, we had a pilot that locked himself in the cockpit after he assaulted the flight engineer. And the flight engineer actually required hospitalization. They were both injured. And this happened on the tarmac before the plane took off. But I mean, it was like a big story in that part of the world. And then we've had some like lesser known events that the news has really tried to bury. One was a JetBlue pilot that had to be restrained by passengers because he sprinted down the aisle screaming about terrorists and Jesus during a flight, and they locked him out of the cockpit because obviously they didn't want him in there. And he's being charged. He was actually just found competent to stand trial, I believe. This case has been going on for a while. It was like in 2012. And then there was another pilot for a Mozambique airline that intentionally drove his plane into the ground to commit suicide too. And, you know, there's been some people have talked that might have been what happened to Flight 370, the Malaysian plane that disappeared a year ago. But this is happening a lot, and these are just like some of the big cases that I've covered in some of the articles I've written about. There are lots of smaller cases and ones involving passengers. And, you know, you kind of have to look at this and say, all right, well, I know there is quite a bit of evidence that we have that was done, you know, decades ago, that this is what happened downwind in cities where we exploded bombs. People had these kind of impulse control problems and violent crime shot up. And I need to get a copy of that paper. So, you know, we kind of look at all these things in the absence of having real numbers or having the real equipment that we need to assess it. Say, you know, where are we seeing mutations? Where are we seeing birth defects? Where are we seeing excess mortality? Does this jive with what we already know to be true of radiation? And in all of these cases, it does. So, you know, do I think anything is going to come out of this research? Not unless we have this huge collective, you know, and pilots all of a sudden like start finding these articles and making the connection for themselves. But you know, we have had intel from people that work for the airlines. So they definitely are noticing something is going on. Everybody they work with is sick, and they're sick from weird things. A lot of skin problems, a lot of cancer issues, immune system problems, and then some of these like emotional outburst type situations, extreme aggression. So that's kind of where I'm at with this. And every day, you know, I track the flight emergencies, emergency landings. We've got more than a year's worth of data now. I'm going back to get all the pre-Fukushima data to put it against the post-Fukushima data. But from what I've seen so far, these type of incidents have gone up across the board almost exponentially since Fukushima happened.
Well, it makes you wonder. It really makes you wonder. And if there's evidence that it can do it, then it's not like you're just pulling stuff out of thin air and making, you know, connecting dots and making connections where there isn't any. You're just asking a question. Hey, look, there's research that proves this can happen. This is creepy because this kind of stuff is happening again, but now it's happening at 30,000 feet. Like you said, the cop described it as a street fight at 30,000 feet. I'm going to pause this right there, Christina, because the break is sneaking up on us. Ladies and gentlemen, do not go anywhere. Make sure you follow her on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. We will be right back. We are back, ladies and gentlemen. Final segment. It's amazing how fast 2 hours goes. It really is. It's like blink of an eye, boom. So, Christina, before we go any further, before we get back into it, I want you to plug one more time, because it's important that people can follow your research and the stuff that you do. The best places to go for people who are just the first time they're finding out about you and your research and Fukushima is tonight. Where is the best place for them to go to follow you?
Probably my website, Climate Viewer News, and then you can just find all the links from there.
All right, cool. And I will. I'll make sure I put a link to your bio page on there, because I think that's got a link to all your stuff, right?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
I'll put a link to that in the when I put the archive up on YouTube and up on federaljack.com. I'll put the link to it above all the other links that I normally drop in there. I'll put your bio link in there so people can follow you directly there. And so if you're hearing this on YouTube in the archive, you can go there. Or if you're hearing this however else, you can go to the YouTube archive and you can follow Christina there as well. And I'll make sure I put it on Federal Jack as well. So, Christina, we were discussing, when we got cut off by the break, this interesting, I don't want to say, well, I guess it's a theory, but it is based off actual scientific data and research, that the radiation could be affecting the brains of people in flight, or being exposed to this level of radiation could be exposed, could be affecting people's brains. One of the questions that goes along with that, at least in my eyes, is how long is this stuff going to be suspended in the atmosphere for? Like, how long could this be a potential problem for?
Well, about 85% of what was released during bomb testing is still in the upper atmosphere.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow, I didn't know that. Wow, you just stunned even me. It's not many people that can make me speechless, young lady. You just made my jaw hit the floor. 85% from the bomb testing in like the 50s and the 60s is still up there?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Fukushima didn't blow that high. Like there was one like pretty massive explosion, and that one went up possibly as far as the jet stream, but more likely it was just in the tropopause. And the tropopause is that very dynamic area of the atmosphere where all of our storms are generated out of. So in a way, the atmospheric fallout is kind of like trapped in the upper layers. And then, of course, with the addition of like cosmic radiation, which varies at certain times. And that was another thing that I had wanted to bring up, is I'm not the only one who's like talking about high rad levels in flight. It's actually been talked about 3 or 4 times recently by spaceweather.com. And the way that came about is one of their scientists was flying to a meeting, and he had brought a Geiger on a plane with him, and he was shocked at how high the radiation levels were. And so as soon as they got back, in fact, I have this article up. It said the flux of cosmic rays around Earth has been increasing for the past week. To investigate, spaceweather.com and the students of Earth to Sky Calculus are launching a series of space weather buoys into the stratosphere, carried aloft by helium balloons. Each buoy carries a pair of radiation sensors, a GPS altimeter, and multiple cameras to record the flight. But they're mostly just checking for gamma. And he had indicated that his measurements were in gamma, which was what is usually, the cosmic source. However, Nuke Pro, which is a just massively popular blogger who either works in the industry or at one time did, he is a very, very smart person and writes great articles about Fukushima and all kinds of related nuclear nightmares. He also brought a Geiger counter on a flight, and what he found was all beta. He wrote, very interesting findings on my last airplane flight. It was during the day, so there was good lighting, no adjacent passengers, so I could get plenty of Geiger testing without getting anyone upset. There was considerable radiation differences in different areas on the flight path, and at the same cruising altitude, basically 11 counts per second to 15 counts per second. And let me reiterate, that was clicks per second, not per minute, per second. He wrote this. The upper atmosphere is full of radiation, much more so than 20 years ago. Cosmic radiation is various stuff, and what you will pick up on an Inspector Geiger will be gamma. There is no beta radiation in cosmic. So he was astounded at the levels that he was seeing. And, I guess to kind of bring this like Germanwings situation and the radiation in flight situation and the soldiers back full circle. And if you studied the work of Doug Roque, Loren Murray, or anything that has to do with depleted uranium, then you probably know that following our mission in Afghanistan in the early days, and we've used DU all over Iraq, Afghanistan, the Gulf War, and now it's being used also in the Ukraine. There was a large number of murder-suicides that happened to U.S. service members when they came back from those places. There were actually 5 soldiers that not only killed their wives or other people on the base, but they also killed themselves. They had all been to Afghanistan, and the Army was going crazy about how they were going to try to contain this kind of news. And it's happened, since then too. And it's very sad that we would do this to our own military and experiment on them in this way. And if you think what they've come back with is bad, you should see what it has done to places that we've occupied and what it's done to the human genome. And there's been just horrendous mutations that have happened, particularly in Fallujah and some of the places that we hit really hard. And that's all radiation exposure in a depleted form of it, not the higher concentration of what we've been exposed to since Fukushima.
Which is frightening to think about. If you think about that for a second, look at all the birth effects, directly responsible just from DU, and then think of that as a weaker form of what came out of Fukushima and what is coming out of Fukushima. I just saw an article today up on, I guess it's anonhq.com. It's one of Anonymous's websites, one of their blogs, and it's right from March 26, 2015. Japanese tea tested positive for Fukushima radiation yet again. More tea from Japan testing positive for Fukushima radiation. So all my tea drinking buddies out there, or everybody that drinks tea instead of coffee, don't do it. I mean, I used to like green tea and stuff, but I can't find anything that's not out of Japan. And if it's out of Japan or the West Coast, I wouldn't trust it.
Yeah.
Speaking of the West Coast,
much bigger job to source food now.
Oh, well, that's speaking of the West Coast. I mean, what do we do about food? Let me ask you this. I know you back in the day you used to monitor the mutations and stuff. You used to religiously take photos of all the different fruit and veggies and stuff. And as were other people. You really got a lot of people out there paying attention, which is great. What vegetables, what fruit don't? I mean, some people say, oh, well, some fruit doesn't take it in, or some vegetables won't take it in or won't absorb it. Is there anything that won't absorb the radiation that you can buy from the West Coast that's not radioactive, or should we just consider pretty much anything that comes from the West Coast, fruit and veggie-wise, to be radioactive?
Well, I mean, I haven't eaten anything from the West Coast for 2.5 years. I source all of our produce and fruits from the Southern Hemisphere. Central America, too, if I can't find. And it's not that hard to find, but it takes a lot of reading with my, really good reading glasses so I can see the teeny tiny print of where the product actually originated from. And I would never eat anything mutated, and I would never serve it to anyone in my family. But, now they have this big campaign going about ugly fruits and vegetables and how you should be eating those because it's so disrespectful to the farming industry. If you don't eat mutated produce, it's just as good as the regular produce. Have you seen that ad campaign? That's
No.
That was something I saw originally, an actual commercial for it that someone sent me from, I think it was the Netherlands.
Wow.
Maybe it was Germany, and they were promoting like ugly fruits and vegetables. And then now they're doing the same thing here. Say we need to make you, like guilt tripping you into eating the ugly fruit.
Veggie shaming. You're being veggie and fruit shamed now. Everything is
Right.
about shaming you into conforming. They just use shame as like a way of conforming people and getting you to like meld into whatever they want you to turn into. It's ridiculous, and people go for it. I mean, now they're going to veggie shame you. How dare you? You hurt the poor vegetable's feelings. It's a frigging onion. It doesn't have feelings. Unless, of course, your mutation made it have feelings, and then we have to talk about that. And then I definitely don't want to eat it if it has feelings, okay? Like eating some GMO, it's probably GMO modified. That's why like, the whole idea of screwing with vegetables or fruit, genetically modifying, that scares people. That freaks people out. But the possibility of your fruit or veggies being mutated by radiation, that's not true. Like, what? Look at the weird mutations. Right. Some of the pictures you took right after Fukushima happened and the first plume of radioactive material came over the West Coast and into the United States. Right afterwards, you and others were posting pictures, and there was a lot of mutated stuff. Not just fruit and vegetables, but plant life, too. And other animal life. And there were other people pointing out there were like mutated frogs, right? There were some mutated fish. And isn't it true that if I think this was a scientist that said this, that like if something goes wrong with the frogs, the human race is really screwed or something like that, along the evolution. Like if the frogs are getting mutated, that's a bad indicator. Is that true? Right?
Yeah. It's something that environmental scientists use to like judge the health of the environment. And it's happening. I've just had a phone call, like a couple of days ago with this lady named Donna Young, who's a midwife in Utah. And she lives I think it's 175 miles, a little bit south and east of Salt Lake City. And, they've had, we've exploded all kinds of, atmospheric tests in southern Utah. In the 60s and 70s, and they burn nuclear waste in Utah. In fact, Salt Lake City is directly downwind of a plant in Clive. That's one of only 3 places licensed to do that in the whole country. They actually burn radioactive waste and send it out into the lower level of the tropopause. So it's raining out on communities downwind.
Wait, here in the States?
Yeah, in Utah. Utah is really dirty. They process MOX there. They don't have any nuke plants either, which is what is so weird because people from Utah think, oh, our state is so healthy, we don't have any nuke plants. But it's they process this waste. They burn the waste. They take in high-level hazmat PCBs at their burning facilities. And so they're burning all this stuff, and they're making fuel that gets sent then to reactors around the country. And they have this legacy of atomic testing, and it's hey, all the frogs are mutated. What's up with that? Well, now they're drilling for oil and gas and fracking there like crazy. And this midwife that I called, there was an article that was written about her in Newsweek just a few days ago. She had delivered a stillborn baby, and she's been a midwife for 20 years in this area, which is a really, really small town, less than 10,000 people. And as she's at the funeral for this baby, she starts looking around and she sees all these other gravestones for babies that are new. And she's like, what is going on here? And so she starts investigating. She actually got the Department of Health in Utah to look into this, and they agreed there's an increase in stillborn babies in at least this area of Utah. They didn't check all the counties. They didn't check all the cities, just the one she was in. And then they diluted the information, taking 2 surrounding counties and factoring that in. So when I talked to her on the phone, we're having this conversation was just about stillborns. And I had just looked up her number and called her after seeing her mentioned in this article. And she had been thinking, it's oil and gas. It's oil and gas. And I thought, does she even know what's going on in the state with radiation that she's directly downwind from? And Salt Lake City had one of the highest contamination levels. They were as high as Fukushima, Japan in the early days in terms of fallout. Highest place in the United States. So as I'm talking to her, and we kind of, I'm talking to her about like synergy between like oil and gas fumes and things in the environment and radiation, and she knew about Fukushima, but she didn't know, nearly what she does now, let's say. And I said, just as kind of a side issue, have you noticed any birth defects in this little town that you live in? And she's like, oh yeah, we have a whole bunch of little kids that have cleft lip all of a sudden and cleft palate. And she could think of one kid that has some kind of eye deformity. And she named a whole list of things that she's noticed in very, very young children, like, 1, 2, 3 years old. And then I said, okay, what about farm animals? Because she had mentioned that they had goats. And she goes, oh yeah, I have cattle. And in fact, 50% of my calves this year have been stillborn. And the farmer across the street from me has lost 8 out of 50 calves. And then we start narrowing it down further. And I'm like, okay, well, what about in your immediate environment? Because she's actually kind of like downwind of this little city. And she said, well, my kids had noticed a couple years ago that all the frogs were mutated in the ponds. So, I mean, what's going on there? If this was happening all over the country, I think we'd probably be hearing about it. I would hope that we would, for people who work in pediatric wards and things like that. And I've had pockets around the country where people have contacted me about birth defects that they're seeing in the neonatal intensive wards. But, we can't get any numbers. And having, some intel from people, hopefully others hear this show or read something that I wrote, or they'll see something on Twitter and I'll say, you know what, I need to talk to this person because I have questions. And, they can fill in some of it for me and I can fill in some of it for them. And really what it comes down to, like, is our relationships that we have with other people. Like, out of all the things that are really important in our life, I think kind of that's how you narrow it down really to the most basic of things, is the relationships that we have with other people and what we can give to their life or what they can give to ours. And that's kind of like the focus that I have to have now, because this is heavy stuff to like deal with all the time. And I never thought I'd still be dealing with it 4 years later. And certainly didn't think that I would be talking to people that are completely studying different things, the same things, but different things, and putting the pieces of the puzzle that they have into this equation too. And, what we have is just enormous destruction of our environment. And all of it is coming from industry. And nothing's ever going to change unless the people that we elect help change it. And I don't have a very positive outlook on that happening unless it happens as a collective. And we're constantly divided by issues in the news, whether it's race issues or, there's just so many issues that divide us. And even with this plane crash situation, I hang out on pilot forums because that's where I get the best intel from. And I see the pilots fighting with each other because this was an Airbus plane that went down and they like Boeing planes. So then it becomes this Airbus versus Boeing issue. And it's this is just ridiculous. The level that we take this kind of arguing with each other to, when the big problems are all coming from above.
Well, it's done on purpose, and it's done to keep us divided. And that's why I say I think Fukushima is one of those things that, even if worst case scenario we were all going to die in 20 years, humanity as we know it will be done in 20 years or 30 years or whatever, then we have nothing left to lose. I mean, what are we going to die from, right? Then why don't we stand up and at least try to do something? I mean, what's the harm in at that point? What's the harm in not trying? I mean, or what's the harm in trying? I mean, there's obviously, if you have no fear of death anymore, if that's gone, and I can only explain this to you from my perspective in life, because I look after facing my worst fear was losing my wife. After facing that fear, I explained to Joe one day off air, and then I got into this a little bit in depth on air, but I no longer have fear. I don't know how to explain it other than what little fear I used to have. The only fear I may have is that primal fear of like sharks and stuff. If you're in the water like that, I don't think goes away. That's inherent in your DNA. Like I'd be walking on water like Jesus. Okay, if there was a great white in water near me, don't think that primal fear wouldn't kick in. But there's certain things you just don't fear anymore. And I think if everybody realized, even if it was such a worst case scenario that everybody's afraid of, right? I think if we faced that worst case fear and looked at it logically, there would still be we'd still be like, well, what are we going to do? Just ride it out till everybody turns into mutants, or why don't we at least try to maybe mitigate it a little bit? Maybe we can change it. At least face it head on rather than cower. I think the biggest problem, and this is from what I see, is the anxiety and fear of something keeps people from even facing it or looking at it. And in a large case, that's what happens with Fukushima. It's so overwhelming to them because they think that there's nothing that they can do, that it's just, I'll ignore it altogether, or they don't want to be called a fearmonger and they're afraid of that. And they don't want that moniker slapped on them, and they think maybe it isn't that big of a deal. And it is a big deal. And again, I'm not trying to fearmonger and telling you to go buy iodine anywhere or anything like that. I'm just trying to tell you there is this huge elephant in the living room that is this leaking nuke plant, and we need to shut it off. Okay, which I mean, think about it. Imagine if they weren't hiding it and they took this seriously, and the entire international community actually got together to solve this. This would have been taken care of already. If we had like Russia, maybe Iran. Why not? Why not invite the Iranians? Maybe they have some technology. No, they're Muslims. Really? We can't. Maybe they have some technology. Maybe they know. Why don't we get all the top scientists from the world together and actually try to do something good for once? I mean, we're always about, world government, and we need to do the right thing for humanity. That's why the UN is here. But they don't. Where the hell's the UN on Fukushima? What? Exactly. Where's all the top scientists in the world? How come the scientists just don't get together themselves? Why do you need permission from the government to get together? And if the government threatens you then everybody, can I just tell people something? If you're threatened by guys in black suits and sunglasses, okay, or phone calls, don't cower. Make sure you tell everybody and their mother. Because the more people that know, the safer you are. The less people that know that you were threatened, if something happens to you, and it looks like an accident, it may very well be taken as an accident. And if you're an important scientist, I wouldn't travel in any small single-engine Cessnas. Just saying. They have a tendency to crash into the ground and other structures. Christina, we have about 2.5 minutes left. I just want to ask you, is there anywhere you would send people, if there was one place you would send people, where would it be so that they could learn about mitigating some of the effects of the radiation, or at least, trying to help cleanse themselves as best they can?
I would say start with water. I mean, it's so important, like the water that you drink. And our family only drinks reverse osmosis and distilled. And I don't have a system for my house where this happens under my sink. But you can get those. They're a couple $100. And I know other researchers, and every doctor that I know has one of these in their house. They would never let their family drink tap water. And it actually has nothing to do with Fukushima, because most physicians are clueless about that too. It has to do with contamination in our water system and all the chemicals that are added to it, and the fluoride, and just even if it looks aesthetically appealing, it smells good and it looks clear, there's still a lot of crap in your water, and you don't want your kids drinking it. I don't even give tap water to my pets. And your body is made up of so much of it, and you need it for healthy cellular function, that I think that's one of like the basic things that you need to do is make sure that you're drinking good water. And I've seen people get really creative with that too, and then just like not eating processed foods would be the next thing on the list. Don't eat any fast food ever.
Yeah, basically, go on.
I'm so surprised by people that I know that are so health conscious and they eat McDonald's all the time.
I ate McDonald's. Last time I ate McDonald's, I think it was about 13 years old. I'm 38. I have not eaten that crap in a very long time. Ugh, it just, even before I was super health conscious, I stopped eating that garbage. Christina, we are out of time, but ladies and gentlemen, what she's saying is the basic solution is keep your immune system and your body naturally healthy so it can fight off the radiation as best it can, because that's the best solution that we've got right now. Ladies and gentlemen, we're out of time. Christina, thank you so very much for all of your time, dear. As always, it is an honor. Ladies and gentlemen, as I always tell you, the solutions to our problems are an inside job. Go out there and be the superheroes I know you all are. As I always tell you, stay frosty and vigilant. I'll see you all again next week. I'm out.